Blog Talk Radio.
Well, here we go, ladies and gentlemen, across this great country. Coronavirus might have a grip. Nobody has a grip on this Cleveland show, not even the Cleveland Indians. This is the American Sports History Podcast, hosted by my good friend Peter Ray, 347-205-9631. Yours truly, Mark Mancini, producing as I give him the podium, the mic, the red carpet. First of all, Peter, how are you? Second of all, how can people get a hold of you? Third of all, you got one heck of a guest tonight, my friend.
Oh, hi, Mark. I'm doing well. Yeah, I have a YouTube channel. It's my name, Peter J. Ray, R-E-A. I have a website. It's Adventures in History with Peter J. Ray. We've made 673 history videos in various areas, including Cleveland baseball, 171 videos there. Before we introduce our guest, I'd like to do a little promotion for some of the other shows on this wonderful the Stables.network, Primetime with the Stables. On Thursdays, Snowman in the Morning. These are Pacific Standard Times. That's Snowman in the Morning. This is Thursday we're talking about. And also other shows, Sunshine Ignited from XYZ Calgary, 12 to 12:45 p.m. with Joe Madden, Nicole Pierce. Also, another show, ATL Prime Sports, 1 to 1:30 p.m. with Todd Corder, John Jurovich, and Stephanie Stallworth. Another show is SoCal Smackdown, 4 to 5:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Tony Russo, Dante Powell, Jen Madison, and Joe Madden. Another show is Left Turn at Alcatraz, 6 to 7 p.m. Mike Krepensek, Bruce Kessinger, and Jonathan Mathis. And finally, another Thursday show, Coach Muddle in the Huddle from 3 to 4 p.m. with Dan Messina. Now, tonight's esteemed guest is Joseph Zagorski, Joe Zagorski, who is really, it's an honor and a privilege to have him on the show. He's from Pottstown, Pennsylvania, lives in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, went to St. Pius X High School, studied in Hawaii at the Chaminade University of Honolulu. Also went to Kutztown University of Pennsylvania. He is a pro football author, and he's written, looks like 4 books. From really amazing, 4 books. Is that right?
I've written 3, and I'm working on the 4th.
Working on the 4th, and the 4th is about Willie Lanier.
No, that was the 3rd. The 4th is going to be on Bill Medley, the former safety of the Philadelphia Eagles.
Okay, well, anyway, so we tonight we're going to talk about his book, The Year the Packers Came Back, Green Bay's 1972 Resurgence, which came out in 2020, and I got a complimentary copy. That's always nice to have get a book for free. Now, now this is amazing. The 72 Green Bay Packers, who won the division, NFC Central Division champions, not a team that it's wonderful guys who write books on teams that you don't hear that much about. They had their head coach was Dan Devine. There was a lot of drama. They made the playoffs. It's an incredible book. I highly recommend it. Welcome to the show, Joe.
Thanks so much, Peter. I really appreciate being invited to your show. I kind of had to fight to get my publisher to want to publish a book about a team that didn't win a world championship. Wasn't easy, but I kind of sold him on the idea that, this was a team that had to not just fight against other teams on the field, but they had to fight against their own head coach. So it was kind of a unique situation, and I've not heard or read about any other team that had to deal with a similar bunch of circumstances as what the 72 Packers had to undergo.
Yeah, and apparently Dan Devine, is that how you pronounce his last name? Devine?
Yeah, Devine.
And he was voted NFC Coach of the Year, is that right?
That's correct, in 72. Well, they had won 4 games in his rookie year in 71 as a head coach, and most people would think that they would probably, if they were very lucky, finish 7-7. Back at that time, you had a 14-game regular season. But the fact that they won 10 games and they played against 5 playoff teams in that year, and they beat 3 of them, including the defending world champion Dallas Cowboys, they had an incredible year in 72. And I just thought, this team needs to be celebrated. They didn't have a good passing game at all. They were really one-dimensional. They had a really good running game, but their passing game was deplorable, and yet they still won 10 games. It's pretty incredible.
So you were 9 years old, so you remember that season.
Yeah, it was. I started watching football in '71, and then in '72, I really, really paid much more attention to it than like a lot of my classes in language arts and stuff like that in elementary school. And I also stopped pretty much taking guitar lessons so I could watch more football. So that was probably a mistake.
Well, what's interesting is I was 12 years old in '72, and I just started junior high. I was having a hard time in life. My sister had died, junior high, adolescence, and so forth. And then, so I became a diehard Cleveland sports fan, starting with the last game of the '72 Cleveland Indians season, which meant my first season as a Cleveland sports fan was the '72 Browns.
Yep.
So I watched every game, and I believe the Browns played the Packers. '72.
The very first game of the year. But to Cleveland's credit, Mike Phipps didn't really play in that game. I believe it was Bill Nelson who played most of that game. And by that time, Nelson's knees were pretty much just all cartilage. I mean, no cartilage, pardon me. He had nothing on. It was just bone on his knees. And so he Mike Phipps was a much better quarterback, much healthier quarterback. The Packers won that game 26-10, I believe the final was, which kind of foreshadowed the kind of season they were going to have. But to Cleveland's credit, Cleveland came back and they still won the wild card in the AFC and went to the playoffs and almost beat the Miami Dolphins, who were undefeated that year.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, the Browns, I believe, had a lead in that playoff game they couldn't hold against the Dolphins, who, the only undefeated team in NFL history.
In the fourth quarter, they did. They took them into the fourth quarter, and they were beating them.
Right. So, that '72 season. And, so now I want to bring up I took some notes when I read your book. Now, you mentioned that he benched future Hall of Famer Ray Nitschke. Now, do you think, did that hurt the team having Nitschke on the bench for most of the season?
Well, yes and no. Ray was kind of upset about it because he always felt that he was still, even in '72, a better player than the guy who took his place, Jim Carter. Certainly, he was older and more experienced, but Carter was faster, and I think that's probably why Dan Devine benched him. But, Dan Devine still used Ray Nitschke on special teams, and he also started a couple of games. But for all intents and purposes, that wasn't one of the major benchings that Devine has done throughout his career as a pro and a college coach at Notre Dame, of all places.
You mentioned this mind-boggling thing where just before the first game of the season, Coach Devine moved the All-Pro offensive guard Gail Gillingham to defensive tackle. Would you like to talk about that?
It not just mind-boggling. Back in the early '70s, football was pretty much it wasn't like a two platooning type of a thing. People were specialized even by that time. It was almost like having O.J. Simpson play defensive back. Gail Gillingham was an established all-pro offensive guard, one of the best in the league at that time. To have him just all of a sudden, right before the opening game of the regular season, move to defensive tackle, it was ludicrous. And I don't believe there are some players, of course, that can do that. Of course, you come to mind, like Deion Sanders. There's a few that can platoon offense and defense. But to have an all-pro offensive guard just switch to defensive tackle was asking for trouble. They got trouble. He got injured, was never the same again. And, it really didn't help the fact that their offensive line still did a really good job, but there pretty much went an opportunity for Gail Gillingham to make the Hall of Fame. Now, he still might make it because it seems like a lot of people are making it these days that have no business making it, but Gail Gillingham should be in there, I think, just because of the fact that he was an All-Pro for a number of years. He was the best offensive lineman they had for a while, and he was a member of the two Super Bowl teams for the Lombardi-era Packers. He was a great offensive guard.
What game did he get hurt in?
I believe it was the second one with the Oakland Raiders.
Was he out the rest of the year?
Pretty much, yeah.
And you believe his injury was connected to the change of position?
100%.
So if how can you explain the move? What was can anybody figure out what the hell Devine was thinking?
Well, I read Devine's book, and he didn't really mention it that much. I couldn't tell you what he was really thinking, other than the fact that he felt that his defense needed some kind of a spark. He had traded for some guys that were, helping. I mean, Alden Roche on the defensive end is one of the most underappreciated defensive ends in Packer history. I thought he had a great 72 season. Of course, you had Big Cat, Clarence Williams, another defensive end, had a superior season. And you had Mike McCoy, this huge defensive tackle who you really almost had to double team him to get him out of the middle to open a hole against him. So they had a pretty good defensive line. I really can't understand why Devine would want to move an all-pro guard on the offense, especially with a running back like John Brockington, and then trading and getting MacArthur Lane from the Cardinals. They had an outstanding running game, the best running duo in the NFC by far. If it wasn't for the fact that the Dolphins had Kick and Zonka and Mercury Morris, the Packers, offensive output rushing-wise was the best in the NFC by far.
Yeah, you just mentioned John Brockington, and he's the guy, I think the one guy that I really remember from the 72 Packers as just one of these elite running backs from the 70s who just couldn't, Go ahead.
He was the first running back in NFL history, to rush for 1,000 yards in his very first year. In fact, his very first 3 years, 71, 72, and 73. When you look at all the great running backs throughout history, Jim Brown, O.J. Simpson, Walter Payton, a lot of these guys never did that. That's incredible.
Yeah, you think of guys like John Brockington, you think of Earl Campbell and Franco Harris and Larry Zonka, guys like that from the 70s. So, I just have a very strong memory of John Brockington, the ball carrier, and, getting a big gain and thinking, oh, this guy is really amazing player.
Well, he was a beast, and, pro football was a running game back at that time. You had some great quarterbacks, but you didn't see the 4,000-yard seasons like passing yardage seasons that you do this day and age. Back at that time, running the ball was the big thing, and when you had a fullback and a halfback, the likes of Brockington and MacArthur Lane, even if you had defenses keying on them, they were still going to get their yardage one way or another, and so they were really spectacular.
Now you quoted Coach Devine, and when he was talking to the team, and he said to the players, quote unquote, "You guys couldn't beat the Little Sisters of the Poor."
Yeah. Let's see. Dave Robinson told me that story, and he got. I guess it was after they had a 2-game losing streak around the middle of the season, where they had lost a game that they definitely should have won 10-9 to the Falcons. It was raining the whole game. And they missed a field goal at the very end. And they also lost to the Minnesota Vikings the very first time they played them that year when Scott Hunter threw 4 interceptions in the second half of that game. It pretty much cost them that game. Well, apparently Coach Devine said that to the team afterwards, and Clarence Williams, the defensive end, leaned over to Dave Robinson and asked, who are the little sisters of the four? And Dave Robinson said, I don't know, but they must have one heck of a fullback.
Now, I like this. You mentioned Redskins coach George Allen, who I remember well. Have you read the book that his daughter wrote?
No, but I know of her, and I'm very good friends with a person who is a very good friend of hers, and she's phenomenal. I know of her, and she's quite a historian of the game too.
Well, if you ever have a chance, if you ever find it, or it's a wonderful book because she talks about her father a lot, and she got fathers are important for sons and daughters, and she talks a lot about her father as a. And I like the fact you described George Allen as you used the adjective ennobling regarding him, and I really thought that was wonderful. So you're indicating he was a good fella.
I think that George Allen, he gets history hasn't been really kind to him in a lot of ways because he traded away a lot of draft picks. Because his credo was the future is now. He wanted to win now, and if that meant getting a bunch of older but more experienced players, then so be it. But you talk to almost anybody that played for him, they loved the guy. The term players coach, that's bantered about quite a bit today. But back at that time, George Allen was one of the very first players coaches. There isn't a poor opinion of him by anybody who's ever played for him. They loved him.
Yeah, I like that reference to him because, reading, I remember him well, and after I read the book by his daughter, I thought, oh, wow, this is really amazing. Now let's move on to the game against the Vikings, Packers-Vikings, and page 140 of your book, you mentioned Alan Page, who was a defensive lineman, I believe, for the Vikings, had 3 penalties in a short period. I thought that was a wonderful. Do you want to talk about that sequence of plays regarding Alan Page?
Well, first of all, I have to preface the fact that Alan Page is in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and rightfully so. He was the first defensive player in NFL history to be the most valuable player of the entire league, and he won that award in 1971. Just an outstanding defensive tackle, very fast, very quick. It was just an incredible defensive tackle. But in this second game against the Packers up in Minnesota, which happened to be the coldest day in NFL history during the decade of the 70s, people remember the Ice Bowl back in '67, but it was 0 degrees at kickoff between the Packers and Vikings up in Minnesota in '72. And, of course, the wind chill made it even colder. Anyway, Alan Page gets 3 penalties on 3 consecutive plays. Now, try doing that. Not like one play and then a few plays later. No, 3 consecutive plays. I believe they were all offsides. So the referees, they kind of had it in for them. And, Alan Page had a reputation of being able to tell a referee in no uncertain terms what he thought of his officiating. And, of course, by the second penalty, he was expressing himself in a little more salty language. And Jim Carter, the Packers middle linebacker, told the referee, he can't talk to you like that. And then Page started to talk to Jim Carter like that. And so, sure enough, the referee was nitpicking, got him for a 3rd penalty. So Alan Page that was it. 3 strikes, you're out. Not really, but Alan Page had enough. Takes his helmet off, and he throws it across the field. One of his Vikings teammates picks up his helmet, hands it back to Alan Page, who promptly throws it again across the field. And of course, Page stalks off the field in disgust. And I think he came back a little bit later when he cooled off, which wasn't hard to do in 0 degrees outside. But I don't think I've ever seen a player, even of Alan Page's caliber, of anyone, get 3 penalties in play after play after play. You really have to upset a referee to get 3 straight penalties, and he did on that day.
Sounds like the third penalty, he hadn't done anything, but the ref was just fed up with all the abuse he was taking from him.
Yeah, I think the referee had an axe to grind, and if you watch the highlight film, you can see the referee is kind of like in soccer, writing down his name on a little scorecard. It was still a genteel sport back at that time.
But I guess they didn't give penalties for throwing your helmet back then.
No, not really. By that time, certainly Alan Page wouldn't have cared.
Okay.
He wasn't kicked out of the game, and players were getting kicked out of games at that time for all kinds of things. In fact, the subject for my 4th book, Bill Bradley, was almost kicked out of a game in college during the opening coin toss. If you can believe that or not. So he's going to be a real character to write about. So.
Now, one of the assistant coaches was Bart Starr, and you mentioned how Starr took over the play calling from Coach Dan Devine. When did that happen?
Around mid-season. Well, actually, Bart Starr was actually calling plays all season long, and Dan Devine was, he kind of reserved the right to change the plays. But after the second consecutive loss to the Vikings, according to Dave Robinson, Dan Devine threw up his hands and said, I've had it. And he let Bart Starr pretty much run the offense right from that point on, all the way up to the playoffs. And the team went on a nice little winning streak. Bart Starr was, as you can tell, with 5 world championships to his credit, he was a pretty good play caller. And, and he knew, especially Bart was an old University of Alabama guy, and the starting quarterback for the Packers in '72 was Scott Hunter, who just happened to go to the University of Alabama as well. So those two clicked right away. And Scott Hunter had a great tutor in Bart Starr. I really think that Scott Hunter learned a lot about calling plays from Bart Starr in '72.
Let's move on to the playoff game, Packers, Redskins. Now, this is the thing that's so heartbreaking. The Redskins put an extra man on the defensive line, and Devine decides to take over the play calling, and so he's rushing into this 5-man, this packed defensive line. And you read about that, it's like heartbreaking, and Bart Starr's beside himself, just sort of walks. So he doesn't. For the players on the team, it's sickening. You're in the playoffs, and then this guy he takes over, and he doesn't adjust and start throwing the ball when they're put an extra guy on the line. You want to talk about the playoff game?
Well, every player that I talked to on that '72 Packers team, when I started to talk about that game, I could sense the depression that their voices went down into. That game still resonates with them over 40 years later. How, what could have been but wasn't, because you had a very stubborn head coach. Now, in this day and age, pro football coaches, and certainly even in college, you make your bread and butter by your abilities to adjust. You got a guy, Bill Belichick, who's made a career on making halftime adjustments. In fact, I think Belichick has he has 8 Super Bowl rings, 6 with the Patriots and 2 with the Giants as an assistant coach. If that's not being able to be pragmatic and to adjust on the fly, I don't know what is. Well, Dan Devine was a very stubborn coach, and every one of his players, former players, will tell you that. And so when he got his dander up, when he got his mindset, you know what, we're back in the playoffs now, I'm going to resume play calling, it was a recipe for disaster. You had a guy by the name of John Brockington. He gave Brockington the ball over and over again. I believe Brockington either got, I think it was like 13 yards rushing the entire game. Something like that. Either that number sticks out in my mind. For a guy that's used to getting close to 90 yards and on average a game, to get like 13 yards rushing, deplorable. All it would have taken to get the Redskins out of that five-man defensive line was to have Brockington and MacArthur Lane drift out of the backfield, throw to one of them because there's a middle linebacker who's on the sidelines on the bench now, and believe me, George Allen would be smart enough to realize, hey, I've got to take Manny Sistrunk out of that defensive line and put our middle linebacker back in there because John Brockington just caught a pass for 40 yards. You know, but and Bart Starr tried, to his credit, tried to talk Dan Devine into doing it, to throwing the ball more. He wouldn't do it. And even Scott Hunter was talking to me, and he was telling me, you know, when I saw Bart Starr just walk to the end of the bench, all I could think of was, uh-oh, we're in trouble. And they were.
Yeah, I mean, when you read about it, you just think the whole thing is heartbreaking, and because, I mean,
they thought that they had a really legitimate chance to go to Super Bowl VII. They figured if they could have gotten past the Redskins, now they had lost to the Redskins 21-16 in the regular season, but that was a game that Scott Hunter was injured and only played for like a couple of series. So they could have won that game, and I think that they could have won that playoff game. Certainly Dave Robinson thought so. The defense held the Redskins to under 20 points. They lost the game 16-3. So a couple of touchdowns and the Packers would have won that game. You know, if they would have won that game, they would have played the Dallas Cowboys, a team that they had beaten already earlier in the season, and they would have played them up at Lambeau Field in Wisconsin, where it's nice and chilly in January. And then they could have beaten the Miami Dolphins because the Dolphins were a running team just like they were. There's a possibility that with Cleveland coming close to beating the Dolphins, certainly the Packers could have given them a good game too. So the depression that the players of the 72 Packers still foster over 40 years later for what could have been is still palpable for them to deal with, most of them anyway.
Well, it must have been just playing the game must have been so painful. I mean, when you're not doing what you can do to win. And now, have you watched broadcasts of the game where there's commentary?
Of that playoff game?
Yeah.
No, I don't believe it's available. I try to collect different games from that era, from the 70s, and outside of the NFL Films This Week in Pro Football segment, I don't believe that it's available. But if you look at the play-by-play, it's Brockington quick dive up the gut, MacArthur Lane quick dive up the gut, Brockington off tackle, an occasional sweep. That's it. I mean, it's play after play after play. And the Redskins, Chris Hamburger, unique story. John Brockington was telling me the story. Brockington went to the Pro Bowl after this game, and linebacker for the Redskins, Chris Hamburger, comes up to John at the Pro Bowl practices and said, "John, why did you guys stay in that offense and kept running the ball up the gut all the time?" He said, if you guys would have thrown a pass, we would have, gotten Manny Sistrunk, our extra defensive lineman, out of there. And Brockington said, "I know." I know. And it wasn't his call, obviously.
The book is The Year the Packers Came Back, Green Bay's 1972 Resurgence. The author is Joe Zagorski, and it's published. It's out this year. We're out of time. Joe, do you have any final words for our listeners?
Well, in the wake of the COVID-19 situation, I know a lot of people were staying at home. It's a great book to read because it's a kind of a story where you really can't imagine something like this happening in pro football in this day of an age where a team has to go up against really their own coach day after day. But they did, and they won a division title in spite of all that. So, hey, thanks a lot, Peter, for inviting me on your show, and thanks to all the listeners out there. You can buy the book on Amazon.com website, Barnes & Noble website, places like that.
Well, it's been an honor and a privilege to have you on the show, and I give you all the credit in the world for writing the book, because my obsession in life really has been reading books, especially history books, including many sports books. So I'm very grateful to all of the people like yourself who take the time and focus their attention and work hard to write books. So thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure, and you guys take care and stay safe.
The book is The Year the Packers Came Back, Green Bay's 1972 Resurgence by Joe Zagorski. Dear listener, may the road rise to meet you. May the wind be at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face and rains fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand.